Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this event with Mitch Weiss presenting his new book, We the Possibility, Harnessing Public Entrepreneurship to Solve Our Most Urgent Problems, joined in conversation tonight by Juliette Kayyem. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our now ever expanding digital community during these unprecedented times. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. You can find our full event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for Mitch or Juliette at any time during the talk tonight, please submit it through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. Also, in a couple of minutes in the Zoom chat box, I'm going to be sharing a link to purchase tonight's featured book, We the Possibility. If you would like to support our store in a different way, I will also be sharing a donation link for Harvard Bookstore. Thank you from the bottom of our indie book selling hearts for your patronage during this time. It makes this virtual author series possible and really does ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And finally, as you have likely experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise. And if they do, we're going to do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I am very excited to introduce tonight's guests. Harvard's own award-winning professor Mitch Weiss is the Richard L. Menschel Faculty Fellow at Harvard Business School and Professor of Management Practice in the Entrepreneurial Management Unit. At HBS, he created and now teaches the school's course on public entrepreneurship. And previously, he was chief of staff and a partner to Boston Mayor Thomas Menino, at which point he co-founded the mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. Tonight, he's joined in conversation by Homeland Security expert and analyst Juliette Kayyem, who presently serves as the CEO of Zemcar and is the Belfer Lecturer in International Security at Harvard Kennedy School. She was also recently President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Tonight, they are discussing Mitch's brand new book, We the Possibility, hailed as compelling and a must-read for public sector leaders. In the book, he imagines a new way of governing that's founded in bold possibility and experimentation, envisioning, quote, a world in which government is flexible, imaginative, and hopeful. Former Governor Deval Patrick praises the book, writing, quote, in a sector crying out for innovation, but where politics punishes failure, Mitch Weiss shows us how and why thoughtful risk-taking in public policy and government is the path to a hopeful future. We are so pleased to have them here for this important and very relevant conversation tonight. So without any further ado, the digital podium is yours, Mitch and Juliette.
Thanks so much, Kate. It is so great to be here on this cold Friday night, and thanks to the folks showing up. We will hope for no technical glitches, but if they happen, we'll get back to you. This is such a pleasure to be here today. I get the honor actually of doing a number of these events for Harvard Bookstore, which is about 4 long blocks in this cold away from me right now. And they have done so much to keep us reading and keep us engaged during COVID. And I'm thrilled to be here in particular tonight with my friend Mitch Weiss, who I have known for a long time, unfortunately or fortunately, because he was working for Mayor Menino. He was the chief of staff as I was or with Mayor Menino when I was the head of Homeland Security for the state. And just given the interactions of the city and the state on a variety of public safety issues, our lives interacted. And so this book also is just really important right now because of where we are in terms of the divisions in this country, in terms of a pandemic and the economic impact of that pandemic. And a new generation of leaders, younger than Mitch and I even, who are actually treating government as a solution, as we see more people running for offices from DA's offices to change criminal justice reform to the House and Senate, with our youngest senator now from Georgia. it is an exciting time to think about innovation in government at all levels. So Mitch, welcome to this event and congratulations on the book. So your book is similar to my book in that it opens with the Boston Marathon bombing and something that for those of us who had been in government was obviously a major moment, but also for the city. So why did you start, for a book that is actually quite hopeful and optimistic, why did you start with that moment? And the follow-up, of course, is what compelled you to write this book at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it was that that day and the ensuing events, which really got me started thinking about, in many ways, the idea in this book, set me on the path towards writing it. It's our latest set of frustrations and arguments that got me to really put pen to paper. But the reason I started with that day was because, as you well know, it was normally the best day of Boston's year, shattered in an instant or two instances when these two bombs blew up at the finish line of the marathon. Lives were ended, lives were upended, but the generosity started flowing in from around the world, right? All these people, how can we help? I mean, even in that, there's hopefulness, Juliette, but how can we help and what do we do and where do we send money? And in most instances, what happens is the big local established institution in town collects those monies, gives them out. This is what happened in other disasters. Unfortunately, though, too slowly, right? So you'll probably recall that at Sandy Hook had only happened about 120 or so days before the marathon bombing. Not a penny had made it to the parents of those kids who were killed, and it wasn't going to bring their kids back, but it was intended for them. And so we decided, Governor Patrick, who Kate alluded to, and the mayor and others, we need to do something faster and quicker. And so we set up to start our own new fund. And the amazing head of our local foundation institution in town, he's not a bad person in the story, but he was not happy with that. And I remember him, Juliette, basically yelling at me over the phone. I'm standing at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, outside hospital rooms where the mayor is going to later visit survivors. And he's yelling at me and saying, you can't start something new. Yeah. You're going to raise less money. And we did. We got started, as you know, with a PayPal account, a post office box. And 2 years later, two survivors asked me to tell them a long version of the story. And I say to them that it's not my story to tell. I didn't get hurt. I didn't save anybody's lives. I wasn't in a role as important as the role you served in these events. And they said, you have to tell that story. You have to show people that government can do new things. And so I was left with this riddle, which is the riddle at the center of the book, which is, well, which is it? Is it what the survivors had seen, experienced, benefited from, albeit imperfectly, but benefited from, which is we could, or is it what the foundation had said? And by the way, which is what all of us, experience many times over, which is government doesn't solve problems or can't, which is it? And so that was the impetus for me setting about to go write the book.
And so a theme of the book is conceptualizing government to go from basically probability to possibility. I'm going to come back to that notion and what makes government more likely to be probable than possible, and how you overcome those. But you have the great thing about the book. I was telling Mitch, if you have sort of ADD of reading, or if you just find yourself impatient during COVID, the great thing about the book is it's like a example after example of just, from across the world about just amazing people in positions that you've never even heard of before, who are building important things for people and for their communities. So there's so many great examples, but I'll just, I have a favorite, but what is your favorite?
Well, I'll be interested to hear what yours is, but one of the ones I like is the story of Mariana Matus and Nusha Gailey, who were two scientists, basically an architect and a scientist at MIT, who decided to start this company, Biobot Analytics, to basically sniff out data from waste, from sewage, from pee and poop. And the notion is, well, if we could do that, we could figure out community health. We could understand the health of communities. And maybe even, for example, around addiction, right? Their first use case I referenced in the book is basically for opioids. And the old way of the old probability way of dealing with opioids in cities was to find out, well, after people died, how many? After they showed up in hospitals, how much? And instead, what if we knew beforehand, before people died, before they overdosed, what the prevalence is of opioid consumptions in communities? Maybe we could put addiction services in earlier and better. And of course, that was probably not going to work. How are you going to get access to the waste? Who's going to let you do that? How are you going to turn that into data? How are you going to turn that data into action? And yet they do. They pilot in Cambridge and Boston. They get their first paying customer in Cary, North Carolina. And I think it's a fascinating story of possibility of trying the new and novel thing. For eons, how did we count overdoses? We counted deaths. Maybe we can do something different.
So, so let me go to that point. So one of the potential critiques, and you address these critiques. I'm not saying anything that you are not Pollyannish in this book. You get it, having served in government for so long. So there's a couple of pushbacks to this. So the first is government also has a responsibility that the CEO of a tech startup doesn't, that the Ubers don't. And you talk about Uber coming into the city and how we had to think about it and stuff. So how do you think about, or just using examples, that tension between, I hate this term, but thinking outside the box, but like, the sort of possibility aspects, but also the requirement, the social contract that we have of government, that there's actually fundamental duties, responsibilities of government that are a reason why they're not careless, and careless is an unfair way to put it, but just, that they can't always think outside the box. How do you think about that tension?
Well, I think, the tension is there. It's clear that government is the backstop in people's lives. Government is relied on, as you say, to protect people, to protect their food safety, protect their economic security, in your world, to protect our physical safety from incursion, insiders and out. And so I get it that Boston is meant to be the backstop. That government's meant to be the backstop. But I try to chip away at that argument in one significant, important, I think, fair way, which is to say that that actually oftentimes what exists today, the status quo, is the dangerous choice. And government, in not doing something new, is not actually becoming more riskier. In some ways, it might be becoming less riskier. Doing nothing is often risky. Let's take the sort of Uber example to its extreme for a minute. When they got into robot cars, I write about this episode in Pittsburgh. Mayor Peduto allows them to come into Pittsburgh and test robot cars. And you could say, well, oh my gosh, like, what's he doing? Why is he giving them free reign of his streets in Pittsburgh? Why would you allow this to happen? We could have pedestrians killed. And we all know horribly this did happen in Arizona. A woman was killed by a robot taxi.
Yeah.
Well, you know who else is getting killed by cars? I don't have to tell you, you're an expert in this area, but humans are getting killed by cars, by other humans driving them. And so I guess I would just say in many instances, yes, governments are backstop, but doing nothing doesn't make us safer always. Sometimes it leaves us in danger, and it leaves us as individuals to bear the risks that are existing.
That's a great point. The idea that the status quo isn't somehow the probable is actually not often true, that we're not delivering on services or needs. And that gets to the second part, and Governor Patrick sort of picks up on this too in his reflections on the book, is how do you incentivize this, knowing that that innovation, that nothing is better than failure. In other words, in terms of reporting, getting people fired. I remember when I started in a career like this, one of my mentors, actually when I was in federal government, one of my mentors said, the only thing he said, the only thing you can't take personally is that you will likely get fired. In other words, that when you're in a world in which you're responding to bad things, often you're just, put down the plague, like it's not personal. So how do you incentivize it, knowing that failure is, everyone wants it. They kind of want it. They want you to fail. Right.
I write about in the book, we have what I call hot stove government.
Yeah.
And it's this riff on this thing that Jim March and Jerker Denrell identified, which is the hot stove effect, which is a riff on this thing Mark Twain had said about the cat who jumps in a hot stove, gets burned, learns never to jump on a hot stove again. The problem is the cat never jumps on a cold stove either. So it's a problem of overlearning, right? And so we have hot stove government. Juliette, maybe you were gonna get fired. The truth is most people in government are not going to get fired from their jobs. You and I, in most audiences we're in, if you ask all the public officials who come to our classes and ask them who around who's ever been fired, maybe if you're Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security and something goes bad, but most people in most commissions, agencies, programs, city, state, federal level, they don't get fired. They don't get fired. So part of how we create the incentives is sometimes to point some of this out. which is it's not really as precarious as you're all making out to be. But that's not going to be enough. I mean, the reality is, you point out that public officials cannot do this on their own. They cannot all of a sudden move to trying new things that, by virtue of their novelty, are unlikely to work, ergo fail, ergo you said get fired. They can't do that if that's the dynamic they're living in. They need the rest of us.
Yeah.
They really do need the public to say it's okay, to offer their encouragement, sometimes their co-participation, so that at every twist and turn, when something doesn't go quite right, if it was a good experiment, if we learn from it, if we didn't waste too much time or money, that the public doesn't immediately skewer these public officials. I think it's, how do we create the incentive? We have to create the incentive. We have to change.
I think that's true. And I think the most forgiving people of government are people who had been in government, right? Because you just realize, like, sometimes things happen, or, if someone didn't force it. But one of the things, though, that and I don't want to be cynical, because it's a very optimistic book. So, but I think it's helpful for people to hear why this idea of possibility is actually quite grounded. It's by someone who has been in nothing like local politics, let alone Boston politics. There's a tremendous lack of trust in government right now. And so the idea that government can be innovative, with this idea that you just mentioned, that we have to change. Well, one of the things that we don't have as a public is trust in government. Now, it differs. People tend to like their mayors. They like their city councilors. They like the local folks. But then the higher you get, it's difficult. And President Biden may be changing some of that dynamic. So how do you think about building trust at a time when this country is divided, and, well, let's put it different, or it's united in its lack of confidence in government?
Yeah, I mean, trust has basically never been lower. It's some bumps around sometimes, but basically never been lower. This is not, by the way, a US phenomenon. Trust in federal governments around the world is quite low. The majority of people who live in developed economies on this planet don't trust their federal governments. So I think it is a fair question, Juliette, to say, well, you're really, Mitch, against that backdrop, you're saying that government can try new things that might only possibly work? Like, really, that's your prescription? And my response is, well, yes. Because first of all, why don't people trust government? There are many reasons for this. One of those reasons is they look around them. People aren't stupid. They look around them. They see that the challenges that face us haven't been solved. So yes, if solving problems is going to take trying new things, then yes, that's how we're going to actually earn trust back. So that's one way you think about trust. The other way is that when we tell people that we can solve the big problems that face us, and when we promise them success, we're lying. We're lying. And so we should stop lying to the public at all levels. There's obviously some egregious lies. We've seen many of those lies told, but they're also subtle, but still pernicious lies, which is, we're going to do this, it's going to succeed. 75% of new ventures fail. This is true in government too. We should start being honest with people. How do we rebuild trust? We start being candid with them about what it's going to take to solve our problems. So yes, trust is at historic lows. I don't think we should be cavalier about it. I think we have to be transparent, open, candid about all this. Minimize the wasted time and energy we spend. Otherwise, we'll lose the scarce trust that we have.
Yeah.
But I honestly think if we try possibility government, there's a chance we can increase trust and not see even more of its decline.
When you look around the world because you do, about innovations in government that are working, could you, first of all, provide some other examples outside the US, but also, are there things that we can learn to promote that kind of innovation here, knowing that our governance structure is different and our elections are different and stuff? But I think it's helpful for people to see where it might be flourishing more.
Well, it's flourishing in pockets, actually, all around the world. I mean, in pockets, you'll see it at all levels of government, all across this planet. You'd be hard pressed to say that there's any one country or any one state that has mastered this. I mean, people like to point to a few, Estonia, Singapore, which I've written about, some other places. But for the most part, what you do is you find it in pockets. I mean, I had written about this episode in Mexico City in the book. They had this thing called Lab CMX, Lab for the City. which was the R&D arm of Mexico City government. It was basically a dozen people, 13 people in a city government, get this, the size of 300,000, who were charged with basically probing the future of Mexico City. There was no comprehensive bus map in Mexico City, believe it or not, 30,000 buses, street buses, minivans. And so Gabriela Gomez Mont leads her team and the community in trying to crowdsource a bus map for Mexico City and Amsterdam. When Airbnb shows up in Amsterdam, Amsterdam was one of the very first cities to negotiate basically an MOU with Airbnb that says you can stay here, you can be here, but we're going to set a series of measures and sort of watch you against those measures and experiment our way to sort of more modern regulation. In India, Nanda Nilekani leaves Infosys to bring 1 billion Indians IDs they had none, like our social security numbers, retina scans and fingerprints. It's controversial for some of its privacy implications, but gives 1 billion Indians access to their benefits for their government and makes it easier to get cell phones and bank accounts. And now is the foundation for health records and e-payments. And so all over the world, there are these pockets. The lessons, the skills, Juliette, the lessons I think we can learn are threefold. One, if we want to move towards possibility, we got to open up to new ideas, more ideas, different ideas. We got to hear from outsiders. Two, if we have those new ideas, like in Mexico City, we have to find ways of staging these experiments so we can try them and learn our way through. And three, ultimately, in the India example of this, we have to basically scale those efforts so that they transform public service for the many. I mean, Nilekani told me he likes to think at population scale. You know, population scale in India is over 1 billion. If we're going to actually solve public problems, we should think at population scale.
Yeah, that's helpful to hear too. Is the innovation around the globe and how if you get enough of it, people will start to think differently about government, even if it's just a pocket or a city in their country. I wanted to ask about. I have so many questions and we want to get to Q&A. So folks, I see there's one good question so far. Whoever that is gets a plus, but please continue to populate. But we're going to talk for a little bit longer because we also obviously want to get into COVID, but I have a few more questions on this one. So I should disclose, I do a lot of corporate work and advising in the innovation space and have work with a number of companies in this. And one of them is a company that really touches on the foundations of democracy, which is voting and technology. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, are there third rails? This is how I put it, because the company gets a lot of criticism. Are there third rails where you're just like, you know what? We got to protect this at all costs. We're not messing with this. Like, it's like when I went to DHS, this is, a little crude, but usually it's kind of like, we're not messing with the Secret Service. If they say they need this, we're just going to be like, okay, you need this. Like, you're not going to second guess the people who've been doing it a long time.
Right. So should we take the skills of possibility government all the way to the vote?
Yeah.
All the way to our democracy? I think basically, yes.
Yeah.
Which is very scary. And I know the company you're talking about, Votes. I write about them in the book.
Yeah.
For people listening and watching, I mean, so in 2018, Votes, co-founded by Nimit Sawhney, an immigrant to this country who had seen people forced to vote under coercive circumstances in his native country, decides to set about to create a way to vote on your cell phone mobilely. Mm-hmm. And pilots this with the Republican Secretary of State of Virginia, West Virginia rather, who had been an Army officer who had stood in Afghan fields, seen shepherds on their cell phone, essentially doing their work, and wondered why he and then his kids who were serving their country couldn't vote easily overseas. It was cumbersome, difficult, not secretive. And they partner with Bradley Tusk and run this pilot in West Virginia for mobile voting. And it goes off swimmingly, we think. And they're headed towards the 2018 congressional elections. And these tweeters, EU security tweeter who goes by @GossDog says, you probably remember this, Juliette, I don't know if you were with the company then, basically says, this is bonkers America, right? Bonkers to be doing mobile voting. And I guess the question is, which is more bonkers? This goes to our earlier conversation about doing nothing or doing something. Yeah. Which is more bonkers when our democracy is framed? Which is more bonkers when participation's where it is at? Which is more bonkers when how long you wait in line to vote depends on the color of your skin?
Yeah.
Is it more bonkers to do nothing or something? Now, some very good friends of mine are democracy scholars, democracy lawyers, software engineers. They all find the idea of mobile voting, very scary.
Yeah.
But are there third rails? And is one of those third rails our democracy? I think no. In fact, I think given the state of our democracy, if you want to take the skills of possibility government, turn them anywhere, I think it's to our democracy, to increasing participation, civics education, free and open access to the media, government capacity at all. I mean, given where our democracy is at, this is the place we should invent. And just by the way, let's remember, this thing was started as an experiment. George Washington, in his first inaugural address, calls an experiment. For the first 5 presidents called experiment. FDR does. Lincoln, after the Civil War, doesn't promise success. He doesn't promise success. His second inaugural, right? It's etched right there in the marble. He says, I won't hazard a prediction for the future. I'm hopeful about it, but I won't hazard a prediction. We have been in the past okay with experimentation, invention, even on our democracy. I would say today, against the backdrop of even last week, against the backdrop of January 6th, I think it's more bonkers to do nothing than to do something in rescuing our democracy.
That's great. And I obviously agree on for a variety of reasons, but I think when it's very helpful for people to remember that the status quo isn't working for a lot of people. And in particular, when you think about voting and how we vote and the amount of time and that we don't get days off and stuff. So here's a more as a teacher. So you teach at Harvard Business School that would, and I'm going to caricature both of our schools where everyone, goes and makes a lot of money and then they give back to the school. So it has the nicest gym, right? So it's like, it is, you're the money people, innovation, technology, corporations, we're going to applaud all of you. And then across the river is the Kennedy School. We're the, do-gooders and run for office and go fix this thing in Nigeria. It's just like, the caricatures both ends, because we know what the numbers look like at both schools. They have a huge proportion of Kennedy School students going to consulting and a large proportion of business school students going back to their home countries to make government work. But that caricature works for the question, which is, why wouldn't you leave innovation to be tested and piloted on one side of the river? In other words, because you can throw money at the problem, it's not taxpayer money, it's not public, you have fewer obligations in terms of privacy and disclosure and legislation, and then see if you can scale it across the river, so to speak, so that the innovations in the private sector then become ways that we can think about fixing the public sector.
Right. I mean, the sort of leave it to the private sector argument is tempting. I think it is wrong on a number of fronts. First of all, and this is maybe a little bit subtle, but all this private sector innovation is actually being funded with public, in many cases, public money.
Yeah.
Right. There's certainly federal tax guarantees behind, for example, Elon Musk's start. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato points out everything that's smart about the iPhone was funded originally by public monies. Public pensions are big players in these venture capital funds. They're investing in innovation. So people have to change their mind. It's not true that we experiment in one sector and we don't in the other. We have risk capital in one place and we don't in the other. That's just not simply true. So that's one argument. Maybe it's more subtle. The more direct argument is that it's all well and good to have private startup companies. Well, mostly good. I'll say some concerns, but mostly good to have private GovTech companies building stuff to help solve public problems. I mean, I like to say that if you wandered in any city hall, and you've been in many of them, and looked at the office directory, there's a startup building for every single one. Yes, voting, but also seniors, all sorts of things in mobility, all sorts of things on veterans. I think that's generally good. I think it's generally good. I'm thrilled to see the rise in venture capital space, the number of entrepreneurs leaving our school. Michael Martin at Rapid SOS. Would be one who's in the news lately. I think that's good. But the fact of the matter is, they can't do it alone. They can't transform 911 unless there's innovative people and counterparts. Mark 43 can't solve on their own public safety problems. They need innovative police chiefs like Kath Lanier in DC who adopted the software for the very first time. I mean, Annie Rickers, my former student who was working on, to go back to the opioid problem in Cincinnati, can't deal with that problem in Cincinnati without innovative leaders on the inside in Cincinnati City Hall. So I don't think there's even a real thing like leave it to the private sector. I don't.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would just say is, we like to think that these private sector companies don't have all the encumbrances maybe public has, but like in some cases, maybe they should. Like, just because Uber didn't think it needed to follow the rules, it did, right? Like, so I actually think if these, in the good version of this, if these companies and governments are working more together, then government could, yes, maybe pick up some of the mores, the behaviors of these private sector companies. But the private sector companies, by the way, could pick up some of the good values, the good public values of transparency, of openness. It's not a good thing that that GovTech companies can sneak things by you because they're not as bound by privacy norms. That I would regard that as basically as a bad thing. And so I don't think leaving it to the private sector for all those reasons is really a tenet.
No, I think that's good for people to hear, because there's always this idea like, oh, they're the super smart ones or whatever. I mean, and the benefits that they get are often ignored. Okay, I want to spend the last 5 or 6 minutes on something that we can't ignore, which is COVID. We are at a time, as I said at the beginning, in which we're on defense. So you managed to be able to, well, obviously it's been a year, but you have COVID in the book. So first of all, can you read from that part, sort of give folks a sense of your prose and how accessible and good the book is, but also maybe just give them a sense of where this is showing up in the book.
Okay, well, it's very nice of you to say. So this is a part of the book. This is chapter 8. It's towards the end of the book, actually, from a part of the book called Possibility or Delusion. It was April 2020 in Singapore, but still March in the United States for another hour when I was on a video call with Ping Soon Kok and Jason Bay of GovTech Singapore. Kok, Bay, and colleagues in Singapore's government technology agency were leading the unfolding effort behind Trace Together, an app that used Bluetooth technologies and smartphones to support contact tracing to slow the spread of COVID-19. The approach, still in its very early stages, had been praised as a part of Singapore's heralded virus-fighting efforts and had also generated questions about its potential privacy implications. Weeks later, Google and Apple would jointly announce plans for their own Bluetooth-based contact tracing protocols, generating similar hopes and worries. But in COVID-19 time, that was still eons away. As Bay explained to me how important it was to understand that the technology wasn't a panacea, how the technology needed to be built with users in mind, and how much more effective it would be as it scaled, if it scaled. Yeah. Kok chimed in, telling me they hadn't been sure whether or not it would work or whether they'd get buy-in on this as just one of 1,001 possible solutions. I lay awake for a while after our call. As I waited for dawn, what struck me was how fascinating and fraught Bay's approach had been, and how much of what he was leading looked like the other exercises in possibility I had come to know in writing this book. And then, Juliette, I go on to basically say that this looked like possibility to me. Yeah. And so much of what so many people were doing around COVID response, so many leaders all around the world looked like possibility to me. But other things look different entirely, right? We had heard our own president say you should consider swallowing Lysol. We had heard these false promises about hydroxychloroquine. And so what I end up asking in the book is about, if we're really being honest with each other, except for these extreme examples, could we really decide? Could we really know ahead of time, before we get started an idea, whether something is possibility or whether it's delusion? I'm urging all throughout the book to move on from probability government towards possibility government, but not past it towards something much more dangerous.
I think that's right. And I think it's so hard for us to think like that right now. I mean, the nice thing about reading your book at home in February is that sense that, that maybe possibly we're on an upswing. I mean, in other words, we say in crisis management, you know, a crisis hits a nation or hits a city or hits a wherever, hits a nation as it is, not as you want it to be. And that mirror that we've seen, whether it's economic disparities, the racial disparities, the lack of a safety net for so many small businesses and individuals, women in work, and the impact and what schools mean for women, let alone men, but you know what I mean, may bring about a new way, new possibility. And so I think there's no other way to get through COVID, but to hope that we're learning something as well. Okay, I want one more question, but we already have 4, so I'm going to go to the questions, but one more question. New administration, if you had 5 minutes with President Biden, what areas would you say this is ripe? We got to get, you know, this is ripe for the kind of innovation I'm talking about.
Every one of his 5 pillars: building back the economy, dealing with COVID, dealing with racial inequity, dealing with climate. On all of them, I would say possibility. You know, I think he should actually ask his vice president, Kamala Harris, to basically be vice president possibility and say, you're going to be with me every important meeting. You're by my side. Here's what I want. Here's what I want to make sure somebody in the room does. And probably with your power, your stature, your experience, your background, your energy, your smarts, it should be you. Here's what you should say. Have we asked outsiders about these ideas too? Have we invited new ideas from people that aren't just in our administration?
Yeah.
I'm all for the return to science, competence, and expertise, but you can take that too far. We need to hear from outsiders too. Then she has to say, or somebody like her has to say, oh, as we try new things, can we stop the things that aren't working and scale the ones that are? Do we have a plan for that? Or are we all in on one plan or two? I mean, just to go back to the COVID example, I mean, I think if it as it comes to getting students back in schools this spring and even in the fall, we have not been nearly creative enough. Not nearly creative enough. Nope. We have one plan, which is to go negotiate agreements with the teachers unions all around this country. There should be 77 other ways also we're thinking about how to get students educated in person this spring and in the fall. On every issue, do we have new ideas? Do we have ways of trying them? Do we have ways of scaling them? In every single place we could take possibility.
I'm with you on the schools thing. The CDC just came out with new guidance, and it's, you know, roadmaps. I love my roadmaps, but man, I'd rather get my kids back in school. On that point, and the possibility of it, it seems is very appealing right now with all of us with our kids at home. Okay, so I'm going to go through the questions, and we're just going to keep me questioning them, and hopefully I understand them. And the first one doesn't have a name, and that's okay, but it's anonymous. So thank you, anonymous. How does public entrepreneurship differ from other forms of government action, such as policy innovation? I mean, what's the difference?
So I would imagine a sort of spectrum of government behavior. And just as we talk about government behavior, I want to be clear, in this country, it's self-government. So I'm also talking about the way we approach things. But imagine a spectrum that on one end is basically government administration, government management. We basically do things that we've done before. We look at the resources we have, we sort of maximize them. You can move along that spectrum to sort of public reform, where, you know, we start to fix some of that stuff, maybe not in entirely novel ways, but it gets better. You can move towards government innovation. I like the word government innovation. Yeah. I mean, I'm all for it. I think often what the problem I have with it is, I don't use it in the book per se, is when we say innovation, we often mean picking up, you know, one thing and we used in one state and putting it into another. And I'm all for that. But that's also not going to be enough to solve our public problems. I'm all for, if it worked in Chicago, try in Atlanta. If it worked in Atlanta, try in Boston. If it worked in the UK, try it in the US. But that has a flavor of government innovation, but it's often not even new enough. I am saying, and I realize to your earlier question about trust, this is a provocative, controversial thing to say these days. I would go even further down that spectrum towards public entrepreneurship, towards possibility government. In entrepreneurship, right, as I said, most of it won't work. And I am suggesting we go all the way to that end of the spectrum, not all the way to delusion. Delusion lies on the other side of that, but towards most things won't work. Real novelty, real newness, real new ideas. I think that's what's going to take to solve our problems. That's the difference.
It's fantastic. This next question is from Teresa Lynn. Can you speak about, this is a really great question because it also gets to a critique of the 1%er focus on philanthropy rather than public work. So Teresa asks, can you speak about the role of philanthropy as a partner in not just funding innovation, but when we see what works, why doesn't it become public policy? So how can we merge those things better rather than viewing them as distinct?
Well, Teresa, and it's nice to get your question, and it's a great question. I mean, there's a history in this country of philanthropy being seed capital for public innovation. Probably the most famous example is Carnegie supports essentially what become public libraries. I mentioned earlier 911. 911 was earliestly funded by philanthropic funds. There is a history in this country of seed capital, and there's the political scientists, political philosophers call this basically auditioning for public support. I mean, a modern day example, I told Jill Shaw runs the Shaw Family Foundation in town. They've done amazing work on getting fresh food into Boston public schools. And, you know, they put their money in, but the idea is over time that the school system will change the way they feed kids, right? Get these fresh food cafes to audition for public support. And Teresa, I think that is a good strategy. It's not sufficient though, for these two reasons. One, just like those private GovTech companies need innovative public partners, those philanthropies need innovative public partners. Jill Shaw can't get her, fresh food kitchens into Boston schools unless there are innovative thinkers inside Boston public schools willing to imagine an era where we can actually serve fresh vegetables along a line. And you need people inside. You cannot just have it be up to philanthropy. That's just not going to work. And the second reason is that philanthropy, and this is part of the critique, Juliette, you mentioned, is not as innovative in its actions as in its aspirations. The modern history of U.S. philanthropy is that it's not actually all that innovative. They've been described by other writers as being sort of the timid billions, and they spend their money much less entrepreneurially than they earned it. And so leaving it up to philanthropy to be our seed capital, Teresa, is not going to work. Now, maybe that's changing. Maybe Lorraine Powell Jobs is changing that. Maybe Mackenzie Scott is changing that. I mean, maybe it's changing, but for the moment, saying we should just leave innovation up to philanthropy, which is not, Teresa, what you're saying, but is a more extreme version of the argument, just won't work.
I can't tell you, I've done this a lot. These are like the best questions. It's like the Friday night crew came out. And so we've got 4 more so far. So I think we have time to get through them all. This is a really great question. I'll stop commenting that they're all great. So this is from Matthew St. Ange. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. And he talks about around the world, the book Humankind, about participatory budget processes and how they end up being much better because citizens tend to steer away from large prestige projects and look to the more useful, smaller, and often innovative ones. Is there any way to create more opportunities for public input on municipal budgets, and how do you think about that?
Yes, Matthew. Yes, this practice of participatory budgeting did sort of start mostly in Latin America, has spread around the world. We do have examples of it in the U.S. It is done even in modest amounts in Cambridge and Boston, given the discussion we're having tonight. There's a mayor, one of my favorite mayors I talk about in the book, Matthew, Melvin Carter of St. Paul. And he's this incredible mayor who runs on an equity agenda, okay? He's gonna bring more equality to St. Paul, but he's clear about what he really means by equity. It's not just equality, it's also ownership. Equity has another meaning. He has a business degree and a policy degree. You were characterizing our schools before, Juliette, but Melvin, who has degrees from both kinds of schools, is adamant. I like the ownership and equity. It's about having a stake and including in budgeting. And so when he becomes mayor of St. Paul, he creates this budget game where he goes to restaurants and bars around St. Paul with essentially a board game. Although I asked him to show it to me, it was mostly a piece of paper, which speaks to how much you can get done with prototypes. And ask the citizens, Matthew, to weigh in on how they want their money to spend. Yes, there's a way to solicit more public input. And the main way to do that is to solicit more public input. I mean, to really believe, as the human-centered designers at IDEO would say, that all problems are solvable and that the people who face them hold the key to those solutions. There is a way to do it. We're doing it. We could do much more of it.
That's great. Yeah. Cambridge has it, the participatory, and I don't know what, what the differences would be, but it's definitely something that people really get engaged with. I mean, in a very meaningful way. Oh, this is good. Anonymous asked, who is the we referred to in the title of your book?
Well, it is all of us. I mean, as I said, if we're going to move towards possibility, we have to move together. It is the public officials, the elected and appointed ones, but it's also all of our neighbors. 1 in 5 people in America work in government. What that means is if we're going to invent new solutions, we need those 1 in 5 people to change. But the 2 people who live to the right of them and the 2 people who live to the left of them, or if they live in cities above and below, they need to change too. So it's all of us. It's all of us. And then when it comes down to the driving this innovation in an organizational setting, to Juliette's questions and to Teresa's question, the we is public sector, private sector, social sector. It's we, it's all of us. We the possibility, we the people, we the possibility, we get the government we invent.
That's fantastic. So Jim Eisner asked, but doesn't possibility in government get stymied by a chronically do nothing Congress, then what? So the sort of, whatever's happening on the ground, we have a governance structure in which things get funded, state funding mechanisms and things like that.
Well, I mean, I don't want to minimize, Jim, and it's nice to hear your question, minimize some of the, stagnation we may feel in Congress or in other parts of politics. But I don't think it's actually right to lay the reason why we don't have more invention in government at Congress's feet. First of all, you can actually look back over our history and see huge episodes of invention pass through national legislation. Social Security, going back further, all kinds of taxation that ever existed was invented at some point. In our modern era, Jim, let's take one example at possibility, which almost died, but was passed by Congress. President Obama's, the Healthcare Act, Obamacare,
Yeah.
Juliette was there at the time. It gets passed by Congress. What almost kills it is not Congress, although that was hard enough. It was this technical rollout.
Yeah.
It was rolling this new thing out in the way the old way we roll things out, all at once, not enough product management, not doing it in an agile, iterative fashion. So here you have a signature policy achievement that the president's party has fought for generation after generation after generation, and it gets passed by Congress, and we almost basically let it die because of a technology failure, because we're not good at starting new things. So I don't think that Congress deserves all the blame, which means I do think we can have a lot of invention, even if we can't get Congress to change. And I do think we can get Congress to change. Even right now, I mean, they have fellowships for new kinds of technologists and other fellows to come in and help them think about emerging technologies. We have new people running, Juliette has said, running for office. We could rethink the way, I mean, we invented our government. We don't have to just settle for what we've got. I know that sounds almost naive or almost too hopeful, but no, I don't think we have to just give up because Congress has struggled at points to pass legislation. I don't. It does, it can, it will.
A backstory on the healthcare rollout. So, I mean, in terms of people so stuck in their ways that it ends up being that innovation would have been better for the American public is it wasn't like they didn't know that this was going to happen. I mean, there were alarms being sounded by people who were brought in on the tech side saying, you don't just open up a website to 350 million people, and all the glitches and stuff. And so, this great framing that you have between, it's not innovation versus nothing, it's innovation versus the status quo. And the status quo, the way we did things wasn't working. By the way, Matthew, who asked the question about humankind, wants you to know that that we made his day. So thank you, Matthew. Okay, my last question. Amisha Raja asked, this is, how do you not want your book to be interpreted? It's a good question.
It is a good question. Well, Amisha asks great questions. Amisha, that's a great question. I don't want people to think that when I advocate for public entrepreneurship or possibility government, as I described in the book, what I'm saying is we should take what private startups do and do it in government. I don't want this to be some sort of gesticulation towards private startups or towards business, or I love your question, Amisha, because I hate when people say, oh, what government should learn from business. I mean, there are things government should learn from business. There's plenty of things business should learn from government.
Yeah.
And it's not about taking a private sector mentality into government. That's not what I'm describing. And but because of the words, there's a risk of that. So I love your question. Instead, what I'm saying is entrepreneurship is not a private sector activity. It's an activity. It's the pursuit, as my colleague Howard Stevenson said, the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. We need more of that. We need more novelty. We need more imagination. We need more trying of new things. We need more pursuit of opportunity beyond what's at our hand just right now. And it's not about saying, oh, you know, the tech companies know it all, because they don't. And I hope that people won't interpret the book that way.
So I have one, but thank you all for your input. These were terrific. And so I have a final question, and then Kate's going to say our goodbyes. So you've got a couple dozen people on this call, people reading the book. Like, where should people, how can I, or people who are interested in this, how can we get started? How can we promote this? Like, how does it begin with one person at a time? Besides voting, although I know that's important.
I think the first thing you can do, if you're in government at any level, again, you don't have to be President Biden.
Yeah.
To start on possibility government, although he talks about possibility at every turn. You can be in a town meeting. You can be on a board, on a school board, on a school committee. If you're in government, how can you get started is open up to new ideas. Go ask for ideas from users. Go watch how citizens basically experience your community. Go walk in their shoes. Step one for you. If you're not in government, go grant, careful, but permission to your neighbor who wants to try something new. Go knock on their door, go encourage them. Say, I know we've been giving you a hard time. You know, things might not work. You feel like we're going to blame you. I've got your back. If you promise to try something in ways that don't waste time and money, and then maximize learning, I promise I've got your back.
That's awesome. Okay, so Kate, are we going to get you back on to say your formal goodbyes? Mitch, this was so fantastic. Mitch's youngest child is cooking pizza, and my jaded teenagers have ordered something on DoorDash, so we're going to get everyone to dinner. But thank you, Mitch. This book is a pleasure being your friend and collaborating with you. Mitch and I got to spend a lot of time together with mayors through the Bloomberg Mayor program on both crisis and innovation in crisis through COVID, with about 3 months of sessions, which was just a pleasure to do. And congratulations on the book.
Well, I just want to say before Kate, I just want to say thank you, Juliette, for being my friend. And if I can ever return the favor, I know with you've got more books on the horizon. If I can ever return the favor, and in the interim, we'll see you on CNN and in the Atlantic and anywhere else. I'm so grateful you took the time for this.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, thank you once again. Just going to continue the thank you train tremendously to the two of you for this fascinating and really, really hopeful conversation. Yeah. I think it's what we all needed. And all of you out there, thank you for spending your evening with us. Feel free to learn more about the book and purchase We the Possibility on harvard.com. I have spammed the chat with that link several times. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night. Please keep reading and be well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.